Joining me today are Dominik Karosser, CEO of CONSILIO Americas, and Jason Bonnert, VP at CONSILIO Americas, who between them run SAP warehouse programs across manufacturing networks worldwide, from single sites to rollouts spanning 70 plus locations in more than a dozen countries. They are here to help you work out warehouse by warehouse which of your site generally need full extended warehouse management and which one do not. So before we get into it, please do us a favor and tell us where you are joining us from. Drop the name of the cities where you are straying from in the chat, and we will read some of them out. I am myself based in Princeton, New Jersey. Jason, I believe you're in Charlotte, and Dominik somewhere in Germany, right? Well, welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're right. I'm in Munich right now.
In Munich. Okay, good.
I'm right outside the Greenville, Spartanburg area.
So to get us started, Jason, I've got a question for you. And I believe that everyone watching us today assume that a high volume warehouse need EWM or Extended Warehouse Management. And we said that ourselves when we promoted this event. SAP's own guidance said that it's wrong and high volume is fine for LGM. And what actually makes the difference is the variability and the exception. So maybe let us, think about that for a minute. And why don't you give me an example of a real site, with busy high throughput where you still did not need extended warehouse management?
Stan, I think it's important to kind of highlight a portion of what you said there, right? The real difference is really in the variability and the exceptions. High volume by itself does not exclude the option for LGM. In fact, it makes it that much more palatable. To take an example, we had a pharmaceutical wholesaler. They don't do any production, just pure distribution, large number of SKUs or products and outbound documents. But from a complexity standpoint, it was relatively low, right? So low complexity, high volume, that actually fits the LGM mold quite well in terms of how it's positioned. Now, this was pre-LGM release. And so EWM really was the way to go at that point in time. But it's a far heavier mix of complexities from a warehouse operational standpoint. And in today's world, we would actually look to deploy LGM for that.
Dominik, anything to add there?
So what we see right now is SAP recognize that there is not really a solution for small and medium size with less complex processes. So that's why they brought up LGM recently. And I think that really closes the gap.
Mm-hmm. So Jason, let's talk about SAP segmentation for a minute. And that seems to be pretty complex, right? SAP segments sites on 5 complexity levels. Level 1 and 2 are clearly LGM. Level 4 and 5 are clearly EWM. Level 3, a distribution center with system directed work, is one where there is a real judgment call there, right? And SAP itself said it's either product can fit a level 3 site. So when you're standing in a level 3 warehouse, what tips it one way or another, Jason?
It's not just our opinion or our experience that kind of drives this, right? It's really also, it's being kind of, plainly distributed from an SAP standpoint as well, right? That level 3 site, generally speaking, prior to LGM would typically be an EWM decision at that point. With the introduction of LGM and the ability to kind of take a site that, with low complexity, high volumes, pure distribution, it really opens up the opportunity to take a look at LGM as the solution. I think the main things that still come into play when you make that decision is really the variability, right? The complexity of the operations, as well as, levels of exceptions that are in the current operations. That really kind of is the baseline, right? And then beyond that, you have, I think, a whole list of questions that you ask really if EWM, TM is really the approach you need to take versus an LGM approach. You also have to take a look at what is the plan, right? From a growth perspective, because that too can come into play, whether or not you have a very short growth perspective where you're going to need something on an EWM level versus an LGM level.
All right. Dominik, before we jump to the next question.
I think there's not much to add. I like that SAP is providing these levels. This is something that we don't see in other areas of SAP, where they really cluster those solutions for each of the sizes of the plants or the type of the warehouses, more or less. I would like to have something like that as well for other modules, really, like production planning, because we have similar issues there. So really pretty interesting, but nevertheless, you still need to ask more questions and you need the experience from consultants that can guide you into the right direction.
So SAP's own rule is that a feature has to be available at least 6 months before go live, or you treat it as if it were not there. Tell me about a real situation where a capabilities gap changed the decision. What was missing and what did the client do?
We see those roadmap gaps influence decisions and influence plans, not often, but from time to time. And we recently had a customer where unfortunately this led into a decision that was not the one that the customer and also we did not want. It was an S4 public cloud WM customer. This customer really wanted to go for LGM, and we proposed it as a solution. And everyone was really like, okay, yeah, go forward with that. But then, unfortunately, based on the roadmap, the integration between LGM and the S4 public cloud was not ready in time. And the customer had no chance to influence the timeline due to a lot of business reasons, of course. And so we had to decide to go forward with EWM. Well, the implementation, I think, is still running pretty well, and they will have at the end a good setup for their warehouses. But as I said, it's not really the solution they wanted. But as I said before, in other areas, we see this as well, like production planning, detailed scheduling. There is a model roadmap for planning scenarios, also S&OP demand planning. But from time to time, the customers are in a rush, as I said, based on business decisions. And so they cannot wait for those solutions, and we have to find alternatives. But I think, Jason, you were in closer contact to one of the guys that was directly participating in this evaluation for the public cloud customers. So maybe you can add your thoughts to that as well.
I mean, I think, from an SAP perspective, right, the official line is you shouldn't really choose a product based on roadmap promises, right? Because things can change, things can get delayed, removed from scope, et cetera. But I think the important thing to keep in mind here is the fact that SAP is actively pushing LGM from a market solution perspective. Even if something is on the roadmap, and say, for instance, that kind of earmark is 6 months out, the idea there is that because there's so much influence around positioning LGM from a client perspective, they too are able to potentially influence a quicker go-to-market with particular solutions or features based on an appetite to utilize LGM, right?
Who wants to take this question from Mauricio?
I would propose Jason to add because he also has experience with Stockholm management, so I guess he can answer that.
I think to your point, Mauricio, You are correct. There is one customer live on LGM. However, we do have an active project for LGM within CONSILIO. In fact, we're already in the testing phases at this point. But from a positioning perspective, I think LGM is going to end up being the go-to solution exclusively. So for the most part, I think we would take a look at what's available from a end-to-end solution perspective, not just now, but in the future as well. So I believe LGM will be positioned over stockroom management.
All right. So everybody feel free to ask your question as you've got them. Jason, SAP said that LGM deploys in weeks and that EWM is a larger transformation program. How long does an MG EWM rollout takes at a mid-size site? How many people and where does the cost difference actually show up?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've been doing EWM for a long time, over 16 years, and I've had, the benefit of being in highly complex deployments, single site, multi-site, global deployments. I mean, typically when you're taking a look at EWM, even at a mid-sized site, you're looking at, it could be anywhere from a 6 to 12 month period of time, right? To go through the entire realization phase and deployment, hypercare, et cetera. Now, that timeline, right, is influenced based on the complexities, whether or not you have automation integration, all of those types of things. So from an LGM perspective, it's quite interesting because I think what's appetizing about the solution is the fact that, it's cloud-based. You get regular deployments of new features, but the actual setup process can be done in 2 to 3 weeks, right? You have a shorter testing window, and from an OCM, operational change management training perspective, it's actually quite easy to pick up and deploy, I would say roughly in about a 12-week period of time, right? Aside from that, I think, from a cost perspective, the reality is that in general, there haven't been too many EWM projects that I've been involved with that are one-person shows, right? So typically you have a group of consultants that are working on the EWM related topics just because it is so expansive from a functionality perspective, depending on whether or not you have automation integration or you have integration to production, you have manufacturing going on. All of those things can come into play on the complexity and the timeline. Drawing out a timeline with multiple resources from an EWM perspective, or even globally, multi-site, whatever the case may be, that's really where you have higher costs from an EWM deployment standpoint. I think what I talked about in terms of setup and deployment timeline from an LGM perspective, that's really where you see the benefits of a quote unquote cheaper solution due to the time it takes to rapidly deploy a solution, right? Generally speaking, the 12-week range obviously is from a low complexity deployment where you don't have to deal with a large amount of integrations and things like that, right? Where LGM sits kind of in the sweet spot. That coupled with the fact that you don't have to worry about the impact timelines, et cetera, of upgrades and being able to take advantage of new solutions and features that become available in a rapid deployment perspective.
All right.
The licensing concept is quite a bit different from an EWM standpoint. You get the benefit, right, of basic EWM with your standard S4 licensing from an embedded standpoint with no additional licensing costs. Now, that's obviously if you can, from an operational standpoint, a business perspective, take on kind of best practice approach from an EWM standpoint, right? You go with a clean core best practice approach. You don't have a lot of customizations. You don't have a high volume of integrations, whether that be automation or anything else for that matter. And you're not taking advantage of any of the advanced functionality, right? Labor management or material flow system, those kind of things, right? That you'd have additional licensing there. Now, That being said, it's still a longer timeline, usually more people to implement. And quite frankly, you get that added benefit of a kind of change in the concept from an LGM standpoint, right? It's based on blocks of delivery documents, right? The more documents you run, the cheaper, one document becomes, right? And so that's where the money concept comes from, and the difference in how it's priced and how quickly you can deploy it.
All right. I wonder if anybody's got a comment in the audience on what you said. Dominik, anything to add?
I also like to listen to what Jason says, because you really recognize there's a huge experience and you really knows what he talks about. So from a content perspective, there's nothing to add from my side. It's just, you asked him that question, or you stated in that question, then SAP says LGM deploys and reads. And this is something, well, a really sales quote, more or less, that SAP has here. And I could also reply with the consultant quote and say it depends, but the juice is actually somewhere in between there. And so a little bit of teaser here, and we will have an offer at the end that might help get more clarity on it depends.
All right. Well, so now, Dominik, let's say I take your advice and I deploy EWM at 4 sites, LGM at 7 sites. Now I have to maintain 2 warehouse operating model forever. My system integrator is going to call that a mess, and they might have a point. Now you've had to make this argument, or you will have to make this argument to a steering committee. What do you think works and what will not work?
The last couple of years, I did a lot of project management, and based on my position as CEO and also partner at CONSILIO, I was asked a lot to be part of steering committees, or as active parts in steering committees. So I was very often on the other side of that table, and I really have seen decisions or decision papers that more or less stated, we want this. And when you ask why, they said, yeah, because it looks good, or because we discussed it, or because the consultant said it. Yeah. And that's actually always the point where the steering committee declines this or decides to not implement those solutions. So it really comes to the point that you need to be very well prepared, not only for the steering committee, but also to make the right decision. And of course, the example that you mentioned is very extreme, but we have those examples, and we will have those examples in the future with LGM growing in the SAP era. And just getting to the other side now as a consultant, as the warehouse responsibilities for those companies, you really need to go down to the business area. You need to understand the sizes of the plants. You need to understand the processes, the complexity of the processes. You have to cluster those plants in regions and product groups that they have. Also, the size of the products is important. And once you have clustered that, you really have to take each of those sides separately and say, okay, what are our solution options? And then you have to add pros and cons to each of those combinations of side and solution options. And at the end, you also need to have at least a ballpark number for implementation costs, because you need to compare that. And taking all that, making or creating a decision paper, then discuss it first with the project manager. So also you don't take it directly to the steering committee. You need to follow that path from the business IT level to the project manager, and then to the steering committee. Discuss it with the project manager. Convince the project manager that this is the right decision in the proposal that you send, so that he also says, okay, I can go with that. I can take this to the steering committee, and I'm convinced that this is the right solution. And then you go with that decision paper into the steering committee. And yeah, if you have good arguments, and if your pros and cons are well thought about, and the ballpark numbers are fine, then they will decide for such a solution. Getting back to the point that you have separate solutions that need separate maintenance, at the end, it's all a matter of costs. So how much does it cost to maintain 2 different solutions? in comparison to having more than 50% of the sites working on a solution that takes more time in their daily work, that takes more training, is more complex, etc. So that's how you determine the best solution, the best way forward, and bringing it to the steering committee. And also here, I mentioned it already, and I really want to mention it again because I don't always want to say this. The warehouse guys are the only ones that have these kind of decisions to make. We have this in production planning area as well. You have small factories with a small number of production lines, and you have huge factories with hundreds of work centers, and you need a solution for production planning. And also SAP is providing two different solutions there, PP and PPDS. And here also, you should not go for a complex PPDS planning scenario with heuristics and optimizer in a small factory where only like 20, 30 people are working, and we have like 4 or 5 production lines now.
I think it becomes that much more intriguing to the insight that you bring, Dominik, around the production side of things, because I think even in promoting this event prior to that, we also posted a few articles around a light production integration option with LGM, right? It's on the roadmap slated for Q4 of this year to have production integration for LGM, but the capabilities to have a light integration with LGM today, they already exist. So it becomes an even more intriguing opportunity, I think, as we collaborate across the production side of things to the warehousing side, right?
Right. So we are getting at the end of this segment, and I wonder if, in the audience, people think that you brought more clarity or actually confused them even more in making their choice. So, Jason, I will start the Q&A section with just, imagine that you've got someone at the moment in a warehouse arguing about the right decision to make, which solution to go with. What would be your advice to that warehouse manager?
I won't say that it's a quick thing, but there is, there's the level 1 through 5 matrix that kind of determines, what path you go down, with really more or less a fine line on level 3, right? So it becomes a bit easier, I think, with level 1 and 2 to quickly make that kind of decision. And it's also coupled with, I would say, more or less a 15 question yes or no questionnaire, right? That really drives whether you have a need for EWM or whether you have a need for TM. And any answer of a yes to any or more, one or more of those questions really kind of drives you down the EWM path. But there's also additional questions, right? So when you previously and even today, when you take a look at EWM, right, if you have advanced topics that would require you to go EWM basic versus EWM advanced, those topics clearly drive you straight to the EWM path, right? Now, that's not to say that that's always going to be that way, because there are things such as, the availability of warehouse task APIs with LGM, which opens up the possibility for, integration to automation equipment, et cetera, right? I think, we also are aware of partners that we've worked with in the areas of vertical lift integration, right? With an out-of-box solutions in relation to that. They're also working on an LGM integration option for their solution as well. So some of these decisions actually, they get a little bit more easier, I think, moving forward as the product matures and the availability of functionality and integration topics and things that, may not be available today are in the near term on the roadmap. And also, things like partner solutions become available. I think in terms of hey, we're arguing about what solution to do today, and I have to answer to steering committee on Thursday, how you very quickly can go through the question.
The yes and no question, right? Those 15 yes and no question. And we're talking wave management, labor management, automation, complex put away. I mean, in your experience, how do you think people really answer to those questions? I mean, and how, what would be your advice? Because it's easy to convince yourself one way or another on that.
Sure.
No?
Sure. I like to take kind of a practical approach, right? Especially since I'm in the land of SAP for so long. And I mean, quite frankly, everything has been from a solutioning perspective, right? Take a look at best practice, right? The best practice approach is going to give you out of the box solutions that are available without, a high level of enhancements, if any, right? A best practice approach means you go in lean, you adopt your processes to the best practice if they aren't already in line with that. That being said, if you can take a best practice approach to inbound receiving, that leads you down the EWM basic, and EWM basic inbound receiving is available enough. So it really starts becoming a question of how different are my processes against best practice, and do they have to remain that way? It's not a we've always done it this way, so we need to do it in the future that way. It's not going to help you proceed with the solutions that are available, especially in consideration with LGM. You have new functionality being deployed bi-weekly, right? So you really are able to take full advantage of that, right? If you're able to break down kind of those silos and the whole mindset of we've always done it this way, so we need to do it in the future. Really, you have to answer that question honestly, right? Not just because you've always done it that way.
Okay, so we are really at the end. Last question for you, Dominik. What is the most expensive warehouse scope mistake that you've seen?
Well, actually, the most expensive mistake was not choosing the wrong solution. It was more underestimating the scope, like overlooking interfaces. We had one customer in a project where we had to postpone the go live for a month because of hardware lead time. So we always mentioned, hey, you need to order the scanners, you need to order your handheld devices. There is a huge lead time right now. You have the problem with the microchips. There is really a gap in supply chain. And then they said, yeah, we'll do it. Yeah, I already talked to purchasing. And then all of a sudden they said, hey, we got the PO confirmation for the handheld in 9 months, and we want to go live in 3 months. So yeah, these are the real drivers where it became expensive because you had to postpone the go lives, you had to extend the project. Also, warehouse network connectivity is something that is very important, which also we have seen a project that it caused delays and this bothering the extended costs and extended timelines. So result were really significant delays and additional costs. So it's really important to consider all parts of such a project in the warehouse, hardware, software, also availability of personnel to make sure that you can finish those projects in time and in budget.
Thank you, Jason. And Dominik from CONSILIO Consulting Americas, thank you so much. You brought a lot of clarity on how to choose and when to choose those housing management solution from SAP. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.